In the year 922, right in the heart of Baghdad, a man was dragged into a crowded public square.
Right.
And he was whipped, he was mutilated, crucified, and eventually burned to ashes. And then the authorities of the Abbasid Caliphate actually scattered his remains to the four winds.
Yeah, they really wanted to erase him completely.
Completely. But here is the crazy part. His crime. He didn't murder anyone. He didn't, steal from the treasury. He didn't launch a military coup against the state.
No, nothing like that.
He simply uttered a single terrifying three-word sentence, which was, "I am the truth."
Yeah, Ana al-Haq.
Right. And, if you've ever felt completely overwhelmed by the rigid, unbending rules of a system, whether that's at work, in a massive bureaucracy, or even just in a tradition you grew up in, and you just wanted to connect with the actual core meaning behind it all, well, this deep dive is for you.
Because it's a tension that practically defines the human experience, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, we build these vast, intricate structures to organize our lives, our societies, our beliefs. We lay down all these laws to keep the chaos at bay. And then, well, almost inevitably, we start to feel trapped by the very walls we built to protect ourselves.
Yeah, the rules just start to feel kind of hollow.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The rituals feel mechanical. And so we start desperately looking for a window.
And today, we are looking at one of the most profound, dramatic, and as we just established with that intro, sometimes deadly searches for that window in human history. We are unpacking the fascinating and deeply turbulent history of Islamic mysticism, better known as Sufism.
Right.
And our guide for this journey is an incredibly dense, very extensive historical source text by the scholar Majid Fakhry. The mission of today's deep dive is to trace how this movement started, how it evolved, and how it completely challenged the status quo.
So, okay, let's unpack this, because there is a massive paradox sitting right at the center of this source material. There really is.
Yeah.
And it's a theological paradox that goes right to the very foundation of the faith. Because Orthodox Islam places a massive, uncompromising emphasis on God's absolute transcendence.
Right.
The text actually quotes a pivotal Quranic phrase here, which is, "Unto him nothing is like."
Unto him nothing is like, so total separation.
Exactly. The idea is that the Creator is so wholly other, so completely separate and elevated from the dirt and grime of creation, that any attempt to claim a close, intimate, familiar relationship is practically contradictory to the religion's core tenets.
It's almost offensive.
Yes. Add to that a very strict ritual basis, right? Specific prayers, specific times, rigid stipulations for physical purification.
It's highly structured.
Very. You have a system that is meticulously designed to maintain a clear, unbridgeable boundary between the human and the divine.
A system built entirely on awe and distance.
Right.
But mysticism, almost by definition, across any culture, is the exact opposite of that. Mysticism is about seeking an unfettered, intimate merging with the infinite.
Yeah, it's about tearing down those boundaries, not reinforcing them.
Right. So the question we really have to tackle right out of the gate is, how in the world did a religion so incredibly focused on the absolute separation of creator and creation give birth to some of the most passionate, rule-breaking, boundary-pushing mystics in human history?
Well, to understand that tension, we have to look at how early Muslims reacted to the overwhelming fear of the afterlife.
Fear.
Yes, fear. Because the beginning of this story doesn't look anything like the romantic, poetic image of, whirling dervishes and love poetry that a lot of people might have in their heads today.
Yeah, that's definitely what I picture.
Right, but before there was love and poetry, there was just raw, unadulterated fear.
Okay, I'm trying to picture this. When I think of Sufism, I think of Rumi. I think of intoxication and beauty. But the text is very clear that these earliest figures were essentially terrified ascetics living out in the desert. They are weeping. They are starving themselves. Where exactly is this intense, paralyzing fear coming from?
It comes directly from the scripture itself, specifically the early Meccan surahs of the Quran. This is what we might call the textual loophole.
Okay, explain that.
Well, the Quran paints a highly graphic, awe-inspiring, and frankly terrifying picture of the final judgment. The text describes the day of reckoning in such apocalyptic terms that early believers were just overwhelmed by a sense of the absolute futility and wretchedness of man's estate in this life.
Like nothing here matters.
Exactly. The believers told to accept this transient world, but they are constantly warned that the ephemeral goods of this life, wealth, status, comfort, they're utterly worthless compared to the everlasting life to come. a life where every single atom of their deeds will be weighed.
And the vocabulary the source brings up really drives this home, I think. Words for piety in early Islam, like wara and taqwa, actually derive from Arabic roots that signify fear, or like guarding oneself against a threat.
Fear wasn't just a byproduct of belief.
It was the point.
Right. It was the primary expected expression of a genuine religious calling in those early centuries. If you weren't terrified, you weren't paying attention.
Wow. But you mentioned a loophole.
Right. Here is the loophole that changes everything. Because alongside those terrifying warnings of a transcendent, judging God, the Quran and the early traditions also present a completely different, highly intimate picture of the God-man relationship.
Okay.
The text contains specific verses that say God is closer to the believer than his jugular vein.
The jugular vein, I mean, you literally cannot get more intimate than that. That's inside your own body. It's the blood keeping you alive.
It's a striking image. And it also says God is omnipresent, omniscient, witnessing man's every deed and reading his every passing thought.
So on one hand, God is impossibly far away on a throne judging you. And on the other, God is pulsing inside your neck.
What's fascinating here is how that dual nature of the text functioned practically for early believers. For those early Muslims who felt completely alienated by the rigid external rituals, or who were just disgusted by the political chaos and wealth accumulation of the expanding Islamic empire, that jugular vein concept provided the exact theological justification they needed.
To kind of bypass the system.
Exactly. It allowed them to seek an inward relationship with God, bypassing the purely external, rule-based worship.
They found a single thread in the scripture and just started pulling it.
They really did.
And the text points out this wasn't just a theoretical debate happening in a library somewhere. This was a hardcore lifestyle. It mentions companions of the Prophet Muhammad himself, figures like Andar al-Ghafari, who died in 652, and Hudhaifa, who died in 657.
Right, the early ascetics.
Yeah, these men were active right as the Islamic Empire was conquering vast territories. Wealth is just pouring in. Their contemporaries are suddenly living in palaces and wearing silk. And these guys look at it all and actively choose a hard, ascetic life of poverty and self-denial.
They were making a profound physical statement against the softening of the faith. But the figure who really crystallizes this early movement and turns it into a structured path is a man named al-Hasan al-Basri, who died in 728.
Al-Basri.
Right. And to really grasp what al-Basri was doing, you have to understand the absolute nightmare of his political context. He lived through what our source text calls the War of Succession. That was the incredibly bloody period following the assassination of the third caliph, Uthman, in 656.
Which fundamentally broke the early Islamic community. Right, it sparked the civil wars.
It tore the fabric of the empire apart. It pitted factions against each other in brutal combat and set the stage for a century of intense political and theological strife. I mean, you had massive violent debates over free will, predestination, and whether a leader who committed a grave sin was still a legitimate Muslim.
This total chaos.
Total chaos. It was an era of profound disillusionment. And in the midst of all this blood and arguing, al-Basri retreats. He looks at the blood being spilled over worldly power and proposes a religious life that is entirely inward and ascetic.
And his method was intense. I mean, the source breaks down his specific practices. He embraced extreme poverty. He cultivated a deep contempt for worldly goods. And he introduced a method of intense inner work. He talked heavily about fikr, which translates to reflection, and muhasabah, which is deep, unrelenting self-examination.
Yes, very rigorous psychological work. And the ultimate goal of all this rigorous self-denial, the weeping and the constant reflection, was Rida.
Rida.
Right. Rida is a state of inner contentment where the tension between the human will and the divine will is finally resolved through total submission.
Okay, I get the fear part. If you think a terrifying judgment is coming, you act like al-Basri. But let me offer an analogy for how I'm visualizing this, because I'm really struggling to connect this grim asceticism to the mystical joy we see later on in the history.
Sure, go ahead.
So al-Basri and these early figures are denying themselves, sitting in poverty, intensely examining their every flaw out of sheer terror of God's wrath, which the text calls al-Khawf. It feels like, imagine you are studying for a brutal final exam in a subject you find absolutely terrifying. Right. You're pulling all-nighters, you're stressed, you're denying yourself any fun, you're drinking terrible coffee, and you're doing it entirely out of sheer terror of failing and ruining your life.
Yeah.
You're doing the work, you're putting in the hours, but you don't actually love the subject material.
No, of course not.
You're just trying to survive the judgment of a ruthless professor.
That captures the psychological weight of it perfectly. And, the professor in this analogy isn't just grading a piece of paper. They are judging your eternal soul.
Right.
The motivation for al-Basri's piety is the avoidance of punishment. It is a heavy, grim, sorrowful kind of piety. It's built entirely on a foundation of anxiety.
Exactly. I mean, that makes total sense for the time given the civil wars, but it just doesn't track with the Sufism we know today. When I think of mysticism, I don't think of anxiety. So how does this grim, fear-based, studying for the final exam piety transform into the famous mystical passion that Sufism is known for? How do we get from terror to romance? There has to be a missing link.
There is a missing link. And it's fascinating because that missing link isn't a theological committee or a new caliph. It's one woman in Basra.
Wow.
We get from fear to love through Rabia al-Adawiyya, who died in 801. She is universally recognized as the greatest female mystic of Islam. And she is the pivot point for this entire history.
So what does she do?
Well, she lived in the same city as al-Basri, and she maintained the exact same intense poverty and asceticism that he did. But she introduced a concept that was entirely new and wildly disruptive to Islamic mysticism. And that concept was al-Hub, divine love.
So she changes the entire epicenter of the movement. It goes from feeling God's wrath to being completely intoxicated by God's love. But I mean, how does a woman in 8th century Iraq manage to command such theological weight that she shifts an entire religious paradigm?
By the sheer undeniable force of her spiritual conviction and the absolute radicality of her claims. Because earlier mystics had certainly talked about a yearning for God or maybe a sense of friendship with the divine.
Yeah.
But Rabia went miles beyond that.
Absolutely.
She started speaking in incredibly passionate, exclusive terms about the believer's love for God. And we really have to pause and recognize how dangerous this was at the time.
Because it broke the rule.
Exactly. She was running counter to an entire religious tradition where you simply did not approach God except in a spirit of intense devotion, piety, and submissive awe. You kept your head down, you did your prayers, you hoped for mercy. You didn't claim to be in love with the creator of the universe.
Right, and the legends that the source text shares about her perfectly illustrate how disruptive her philosophy was. My absolute favorite is the story where someone asks her if she hated Satan.
Oh, that's a classic one.
Yeah, which, in a heavily dualistic, law-based religion, is a pretty standard theological softball question. You're supposed to hate the devil. That is religion 101.
Right, it's a test of orthodoxy.
Exactly. But her response is totally sideways. She says, "My love of God has barred me from occupying myself with the hate of Satan."
It's a complete psychological paradigm shift. She's saying her internal landscape is so entirely consumed by the blinding light of divine love that there is literally no real estate left for negative emotions.
None.
Not even towards the ultimate cosmic enemy. She's rendering Satan irrelevant, which is a staggering theological claim.
And there's an even more intense story in the text where she dreams of the prophet Muhammad. He appears to her in this dream and asks, "Oh, Rabia, do you love me?" Now, in the context of the Islamic faith, loving and revering the prophet is paramount.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah,
He's the seal of the prophets,
Yeah.
the messenger of the Quran.
But her answer in the dream is wild. She says, "O apostle of God, is there anyone who does not love you? However, my love of God Almighty has filled my heart so completely that there is no room left in it for the love or hate of anybody else."
Yeah, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, think about the implications of what she is saying there. She is effectively telling the central mediator of the faith, the man who founded the religion, that he is secondary to her direct, all-consuming personal love for the divine.
She just bypassed him completely.
She's bypassing the established hierarchy entirely.
She actually wrote a famous poem about having two loves for God that really breaks down the mechanics of this. I have it here. She wrote, "I love thee with two loves, a love of passion and a love prompted by thy worthiness as an object of love."
Yes.
She explains that the love of passion is just repeating his name constantly, completely obsessing over the beloved to the exclusion of everything else in the world. But the second love, the love of worthiness, is when God actually removes the veil so she can see him directly.
What she's describing in that poem is the concept of absolute disinterested love.
Disinterested love.
Yeah. In a fear-based system, religion is transactional. I do my prayers, I give charity, I fast. In return, I avoid the fires of hell, and I get the rewards of heaven.
Right, studying for the final exam.
Exactly. Rabia shatters that transaction. She isn't loving God to get into heaven, and she isn't loving God to avoid hell. She's loving God simply because God, by his very nature, is worthy of being loved.
Just for who he is.
Right. It is a pure, almost romantic pursuit that makes the traditional rewards and punishments of religion completely irrelevant.
So Rabia completely upends the system by injecting this disinterested love.
Mhm.
But this creates a massive practical problem. How do you practice a religion of pure, boundaryless love in a society that is built on strict physical rules and rituals?
It becomes very complicated.
Yeah, and some people didn't just write poetry about it, they took it to the absolute extreme of physical action. Look at what happens to a prince named Ibrahim B. Adam, who died in 776. The text shares a legend about him that sounds eerily identical to the story of Gautama Buddha.
The parallels are striking, honestly, and it really highlights how these ascetic mystical archetypes transcend specific religions. So Ibrahim was a prince of bulk, surrounded by immense wealth, luxury, and all these worldly pleasures.
Right.
The legend goes that one day he's out hunting, enjoying a royal pastime, and he hears a disembodied voice speak to him twice, asking a devastatingly simple question. Is this what you were born for?
Wow. Talk about an existential slap in the face.
Exactly. Yeah. It pierces right through the royal armor. And the intervention works. He immediately repents, he dismounts his horse, and he trades his expensive royal garments for the rough woolen tunic of a passing shepherd.
Just walks away from all of it.
Yes, he wanders out into the harsh desert to seek God. The legend says he spent 40 years journeying to Mecca, but not because it was far, because he would stop to perform 2 genuflections, which is touching his forehead to the ground in prayer, with every single step he took.
40 years of walking to a city. He even mused to himself along the way, our source notes. Others make the journey on their feet, whereas I make it on my head.
But the punchline of this legend is where it ties directly back to Rabia and that radical shift in mystical thinking.
Right.
Ibrahim finally arrives in Mecca after 40 years of agonizing, step-by-step physical devotion. He is into the ultimate outward religious work. But when he finally gets there, the Kaaba, the sacred shrine, the black cube that is the holiest site in Islam, the entire object of his grueling pilgrimage, is gone. It's missing.
He literally cannot find the most famous building in the world.
Right. And a divine voice tells him that the Kaaba has gone out to the desert to meet Rabia.
Which is a wild enough image on its own, honestly. The idea that this massive holy building got up and left to go greet this female mystic out in the desert. But Rababia's response to the Kaaba coming to her is the real kicker here.
What does she say?
She looks at this flying shrine and says, "It is not the Kaaba, but its Lord that I want. For what use is the Kaaba to me?"
Wow. What's fascinating here is what that statement represents in the broader context of Islamic history. Rabia's absolute casual dismissal of the holiest physical shrine in the Islamic world marks a very dangerous turning point.
Oh, so.
Because the inward journey, this passionate, direct, unmediated connection to God, is beginning to openly supersede the outward law and the physical rituals. She is essentially rendering the physical institutions of the religion, the buildings, the pilgrimages, the clerical authority obsolete in the face of direct divine love.
And if you are listening to this right now, think about a time you tried to change a fundamental rule in your workplace or your community. People push back, right? People get defensive.
Oh, always.
Now imagine doing that in an 8th century empire where the penalty for breaking religious rules is literally death. You can see how that attitude would start making the orthodox authorities very, very nervous. You have these mystics basically saying, we don't need your buildings, we don't need your rules, we just have a direct line to the beloved.
And as this movement, based on love and inwardness, grows, it inevitably begins to migrate and scale. The center of mystical activity shifts from Basra to Baghdad, which had just become the political, intellectual, and religious capital of the whole Abbasid Empire in 762.
So they're moving to the big city.
Yes, Baghdad was a booming metropolis, a major crossroads of global trade and ideas.
But pure emotion, pure passion. It's chaotic, right? It can't sustain a movement on its own, especially in a massive intellectual city like Baghdad. If you're going to build a lasting tradition, you need a system. You need architecture for the soul.
You do.
You need to map out how you actually get from point A, a normal person, to point B, someone experiencing divine love. And that's what happens in Baghdad.
Precisely. We see the emergence of what we might call the architects of the mystical path. One of the first major figures here is al-Muhasibi, who died in 857. He brought a rigorous analytical focus back to self-examination. In fact, his name, al-Muhasibi, literally means he who examines his conscience.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. He believed the touchstone of genuine piety was a readiness to suffer the worst tribulations in the service of God, whom he viewed primarily as the beloved.
So he's synthesizing. He's taking the painful ascetic suffering of the early days with al-Basri and combining it with the ecstatic divine love of Rabia.
Yes, he's creating a methodology.
Sure.
But the real structural systematization comes with an Egyptian figure named Dul-Nun al-Misri, who died in 859.
Oh, the alchemist.
Right. He's an almost legendary character in the source text, rumored to be an alchemist, a philosopher, someone deeply versed in Hellenistic thought. And he looked at the mystical journey and broke it down into a highly specific, actionable framework.
What did that look like?
He proposed that the path to God consisted of a series of stations, which in Arabic are maqamat, and a corresponding series of states, which are awal.
Yeah, the source text makes a really crucial distinction between these two concepts. Can you walk us through the mechanics of a station versus a state?
Sure. So the stations, the maqamat, are the steps that the human being earns through their own grueling endeavor and hard work. Think of them as the rigorous training a spiritual athlete has to undergo.
Like practice.
Exactly.
Yeah.
These are things like repentance, patience, poverty, trust in God. You can actively practice patience. You can actively choose poverty. It requires intense willpower and effort.
Right, so that's the ascetic grind.
But the states, the awal, are completely different. States are sudden, unpredictable flashes of grace or spiritual conditions that are given directly by God.
So you don't control them.
Not at all. These are things like ecstasy, longing, overwhelming joy, or a sudden profound sorrow. You cannot earn a state. You cannot force yourself to feel genuine ecstasy. You can only prepare your inner landscape by mastering the stations so that you are ready to receive the state when God decides to grant it.
It's like building a lightning rod.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, you can build the rod. That's the station. You put in the work. You can put it on the roof. You can ground the wire. But you can't make the lightning strike. The lightning is the state.
That is the perfect mechanism to describe it, yes. Dul-Nun provided a map for the inner landscape. It gave mystics across the empire a shared vocabulary to describe their progress.
Right.
But the person who really defined the ultimate destination of that map, the final lightning strike, was a man named al-Junayd, who died in 910. He is universally venerated in the Sufi tradition, respected by both the strict orthodox scholars and the more radical heterodox thinkers.
Al-Junayd is the pivotal pioneer of Baghdad. He took all of this yearning, all these stations and states, and rigorously defined the ultimate mystical experience. He introduced these twin concepts that become the bedrock of all future Sufism.
Right, Fana and Baqa.
Exactly. Fana, which means self-destruction or annihilation, and Baqa, which means restoration to a state of original eternity.
And his logic here is deep and highly philosophical. For Junayd, the starting point of mysticism is the divine covenant that God made with humanity before creating them in time.
Before time began.
Yes. According to Islamic theology, man existed as a pure idea in the divine mind before he was given messy physical existence in the material world. Junayd argued that the ultimate vocation of the mystic is to isolate that eternal spark from the temporal grime.
To reduce a human being back to their pre-existent condition. Okay, let me try another analogy here to see if I have the mechanics of this right.
Go for it.
I'm thinking about Fauna like doing a factory reset on a smartphone.
Okay, a factory reset.
Yeah. Over time, you buy a phone and it gets cluttered. You download apps, you take photos, you change the settings, you get text messages, all of that data. That's your personal ego, your memories, your desires, your unique identity in time and space.
Right.
Doing a factory reset wipes all of that personal data completely away.
Mm-hmm.
It deletes the you on the phone, returning the device to the manufacturer's original blank state.
That analogy works beautifully because it highlights the necessity of deletion.
The deletion is the painful part.
Exactly. The user settings, the apps, the photos, that is the temporal self, the ego, the desires that tie you to this world. Fana is the agonizing, terrifying process of clicking delete all. As Junayd so vividly put it, the mystic is reduced to dust, killed, buried, so that they become dead to themselves and alive only unto God.
Wow.
Once that absolute isolation of the temporal from the eternal is complete, once the screen goes black and reboots, that is Baqa. You exist not as an individual ego with your own desires, but simply as a pure idea in the mind of God, resting exactly as you were before time began.
But the text points out something really crucial here. This idea, destroying the self to merge with the eternal, isolating the soul from time and space, it sounds a lot less like traditional rule-following Islam and a lot more like Eastern philosophy.
It does, and that is not a coincidence. Our source notes that as Sufism matured in places like Baghdad, and as it grew bolder in its conceptualization of self-destruction, it clearly began absorbing the broader intellectual currents of the East. The parallels to Hindu Samkhya Yoga and Vedantic metaphysics are undeniable.
Specifically, the text mentions Vinakajana, or knowledge of difference. But how exactly did Hindu philosophy end up influencing Islamic mystics in Baghdad?
Well, geography and the Silk Road.
Hmm.
The Islamic Empire had expanded massively to the east, pushing into regions like Khorasan, Central Asia, and the borders of the Indian subcontinent.
Right, they were a massive empire by then.
Exactly. And Baghdad was the hub where all this trade and intellectual exchange converged. You had massive translation movements happening. Texts were being translated from Sanskrit, Persian, and Greek into Arabic.
Oh, so they were actively reading this stuff.
Yes. And in yoga mysticism, the core aim is often the isolation of the soul and the realization of an eternal mode of being outside space and time, which requires the absolute destruction of particular individual existence. It's highly likely that these ancient philosophical currents began to mingle with and cross-pollinate early Sufi thought, giving them the conceptual tools to articulate fauna.
Which is a brilliant synthesis, but it's also incredibly risky. I mean, Junayd was theorizing about this intense self-destruction as factory reset, but he was very, very careful.
He was.
He stayed within orthodox bounds. He knew how to talk about it in dense, guarded language without getting himself killed by the religious police. But what happens when mystics aren't as careful as Junayd? What happens when they take fauna literally, completely wipe the ego, and actually start believing they have become God?
That is where Sufism steps out onto the dangerous edge. When the inward journey completely eclipses the outward law, when you truly believe your ego is dead and only God remains, the rules of society start breaking down incredibly fast.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The text notes that some Sufis began actively bypassing foundational Islamic laws.
Give me an example. Because if you break the rules in a theocracy, there are consequences.
A prime example is celibacy. They started enforcing celibacy as a rigid spiritual ideal.
Wait, if the Prophet Muhammad is the ultimate example in Islam, and he famously married and had a family, how on earth did they justify celibacy to the authorities? Aren't they directly contradicting the founder of the religion?
They justified it through a radical reinterpretation of emulation.
Meaning?
Well, the orthodox view was that you emulate the prophet by copying his outward actions. If he married, you marry. The radical Sufis argued that true emulation meant achieving the inward spiritual state of the prophet.
I see.
They believed that earthly attachments, including family and sexual desire, anchored the soul to the temporal world, preventing the factory reset of fauna. So they prioritized their internal mystical logic over the literal emulation of the prophet's biography. They even started downplaying Muhammad's role as an intercessor between God and man.
Because if you have achieved direct union, if you are experiencing baka and living as a thought in God's mind, why do you need a mediator? You're already there.
Precisely. The logic is sound internally, but politically and theologically, it is explosive.
Yeah.
But the most extreme examples of this dangerous edge are found in the so-called intoxicated Sufis. The first major figure here is Abu Yazid al-Bastami, who died in 875.
Bastami.
Right. Interestingly, our source notes he actually learned this specific doctrine of extinction and unity from an Indian convert to Islam, Abu Ali al-Sindi, which further cements that Eastern Vedantic connection we just discussed.
Bastami took austerity to a level that sounds like body horror. I mean, he wanted to strip himself of his human condition completely. But what he's really known for historically are his utterances, known as shatiyat.
Yes, the ecstatic utterances.
These wild, ecstatic, pantheistic statements that he would shout in the streets. He would go into these trances where he believed his ego was completely annihilated, and he would say things like, "Glory be to me, how great is my worth," or he would speak to God and say, "I am thou."
The most shocking utterance detailed in the text is his vision of the afterlife. Bastami claimed he plunged into the cosmic realm of ideas, piercing through the veils of divinity, searching desperately for God.
Like a cosmic journey.
Yes. He journeys through the celestial spheres until he finally reaches the ultimate destination, the divine throne itself, and he found the throne empty.
Empty.
So he cast himself upon it, sat down, and realized that, I am I? Yea, I am I. He turned back into what he sought. It was him and no other.
He sat on God's empty throne. Here's where it gets really interesting, though. How does a guy in the 9th century Islamic Empire survive making claims that placed him effectively above God? You'd think the Abbasid authorities would execute him immediately for blasphemy.
They certainly wanted to. I mean, he was exiled multiple times. But He survived the executioner's sword through a brilliant, desperate dodge. He faked madness.
Fakes madness.
Yeah. When he was accused of laxity in his rituals or dragged before authorities for making these heretical claims of divinity, he would act completely insane. And in that era, the mads were often seen as being touched by God or mentally incapacitated in a way that exempted them from normal legal and religious culpability.
Wow.
It was a societal loophole that saved his life.
He played the madness card to stay alive. It's a genius survival tactic, really. But there was another Sufi who came along a few decades later who absolutely refused to play that card. He refused to hide behind madness. And his story is the horrific cinematic hook we started this deep dive with. We're talking about al-Hallaj, who died in 922.
Hallaj is a central, pivotal tragedy in this history. He actually studied under Junayd in Baghdad for 20 years.
Oh, under the guy who invented fauna.
Yes. But Junayd, the careful orthodox theorizer, eventually broke with him. Junayd found Hallaj arrogant, reckless, and far too willing to dispense with scripture and ritual in public. Hallaj pushed way past Junayd's carefully guarded theories of fauna and embraced a concept he called Ain al-Jem, or the essence of union.
And this wasn't just a quiet internal meditation for him. The mechanics of his belief were terrifying to the establishment because he believed that God literally spoke directly through him. He didn't think his self was just destroyed and quietly resting in God's mind. He thought his self was elevated into such an intimate communion with God that they were functionally vocally one. When he spoke, God spoke.
And his physical lifestyle matched this intense, unyielding rhetoric. His austerities were legendary, designed to prove his complete mastery over his physical form. The text describes how, during a pilgrimage to Mecca, he remained completely immobile for a whole yem in the courtyard of the mosque.
Whole year.
Yes. He would sit out in the blazing high-noon Arabian sun on a rock. One of his disciples claimed he never actually lay down to sleep. He would only sleep standing up or squatting for an hour at a time.
People genuinely thought he was trying to rival God in his capacity for physical endurance. But fasting and standing in the sun doesn't get you executed. Things really went off the rails when he moved back to Baghdad and embarked on a highly public career of preaching.
Right, he took it to the streets.
He stopped being a quiet, cloistered ascetic in the desert and started publicly associating with all sorts of people, philosophers, statesmen, commoners. He was preaching this radical message of union with God right in the crowded markets.
And that completely confused and angered almost every facet of society. The philosophers didn't know what to make of his ecstatic claims. The jurists thought he was a blatant heretic teaching people to abandon the law. And worst of all, he started getting involved in the volatile politics of Baghdad.
The politics, that's always a tipping point.
Exactly. He apparently aligned himself at one point with a dissident political faction, the Shiite, or Alid cause, which made him an immediate, tangible threat to the Abbasid state.
So you have a guy who claims God is speaking through him, preaching to the uneducated masses, openly ignoring the religious laws, and dabbling in seditious politics against the caliph. It is a recipe for disaster.
It was a slow-motion car crash. It actually took years to bring him down. He was arrested, exposed as a political agent, and thrown into a Baghdad jail for 9 years.
9 years.
But finally, during a massive show trial, he was convicted of blasphemy.
Yeah.
The official charge was his claim to be God famously saying Ana al-Haq, meaning I am the truth or I am God, and his claim that he had the authority to free ordinary people from the ritual prescriptions of the Islamic law, like the pilgrimage to Mecca.
His defense at the trial is fascinating, though, because he isn't raving like a lunatic. When they confronted him with letters where he spoke in the first person as God, he just calmly explained his theology to the judges. He essentially said, I'm not saying my human ego is God. I'm saying this is the essence of union. My ego is gone. It's God writing or speaking through me. I'm just the hollow instrument.
But the vizier, the caliph, the orthodox authorities, they weren't interested in theological subtlety or the mechanics of hollow instruments. They saw a political and religious insurgency that had to be neutralized completely and publicly. And they didn't just execute him. They made a horrifying, unforgettable spectacle of it.
We mentioned it at the beginning, but the climax of his story in the text is just brutal. He had originally just been ordered to be whipped and decapitated by the caliph, a standard execution for the time.
Right.
But the vizier, acting on sheer terror of Hallaj's influence, went much further. Hallaj was brought to the square. He was whipped 1,000 times. His hands and feet were cut off. He was crucified on a gibbet, then decapitated. His body was cremated, and then his ashes were taken up to a minaret and scattered to the four winds just to ensure he couldn't be buried, and turned into a martyr's shrine.
It was absolute visceral overkill. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, that level of brutal overkill tells you exactly how terrified the establishment was of what Hallaj represented. His execution was a stern, undeniable warning broadcast to the entire mystical movement across the empire.
Like, don't try this.
Exactly. Mysticism had exploded the conventional forms of religion. It had offered unparalleled spiritual freedom, but it had finally crossed a fatal political and theological line.
Nothing like this had ever happened in the history of Muslim piety. A prominent holy man publicly butchered by the state. Hallaj's death plunged Sufism into a massive existential crisis. They had a choice. They had to adapt, they had to prove they weren't heretics, or they were going to be wiped out entirely by the state.
And following that immense trauma, the movement produced exactly what it needed to survive. Intellectual giants. Men who could take these wild, ecstatic, dangerous experiences and wrap them in rigorous, orthodox-friendly, bulletproof philosophy. These men became the grand synthesizers.
The first of these grand synthesizers is al-Ghazali. We have to spend some time on al-Ghazali because he is a massive, towering figure in Islamic philosophy. He essentially used a Neoplatonic hierarchy to save Sufism from the executioner's sword.
Ghazali was uniquely positioned for this rescue mission. He wasn't some wild ascetic in the desert. He was a deeply respected mainstream Orthodox scholar, a professor in Baghdad with a massive intellect.
So he had credibility.
Absolute credibility. But he experienced a profound, paralyzing spiritual crisis where he doubted everything he knew. He left his prestigious post, wandered as a Sufi, and found the answer in mysticism. He then took it upon himself to harmonize the dangerous mystical experience of fana with mainstream acceptable theology. And as you mentioned, he used a framework borrowed from Neoplatonism, specifically a metaphor of light.
Okay, let's break down this Neoplatonic physics of reality. In his famous treatise, the Mishkat al-Anwar, he interprets a specific Quranic verse about God being the light of heaven and earth. He builds this whole cosmic hierarchy. He says God is the supreme light, the only true source of illumination. Everything else in the universe, archangels, subordinate spirits, human beings, rocks, trees, the physical world, they are all just derivative lights. They only exist because they receive their light from the supreme light.
The crucial mechanism here is that because their being is purely derivative, Ghazali argues that the universe and humans do not actually possess essential independent being. Only God has essential being. Therefore, when the mystic reaches the pinnacle of spiritual reality through fana, they see visually and intellectually that there is no true being in the world other than God. They realize that everything other than God is pure, essential non-being.
Okay, hold on, wait. I'm trying to follow the logic here. If the mystic achieves this state, looks around, and sees neither themselves nor any other being but only God's face, isn't that exactly the pantheism that got Hallaj brutally executed? Isn't Ghazali just saying the exact same thing Bastami said when he claimed, "I am thou"? How does this save Sufism?
It sounds incredibly similar on the surface, but this is where Ghazali deploys a genius philosophical distinction. He argues that what these overly intoxicated mystics achieved wasn't identity with God. It wasn't that the human ego became God, it was simply the ultimate realization of God's absolute unity.
The text actually has a great quote explaining this exact distinction from a scholar named Wenzink. He says, "According to pantheism, God does not exist except through the universe. According to Ghazali, the universe does not exist at all."
That is the monotheistic loophole that saved the Sufis. Think about it like a movie theater. Ghazali is saying that God is the projector bulb. The universe, human beings, our egos, we are just the images projected onto the screen.
Okay.
Pantheism says the characters on the screen are the projector. Ghazali says the characters on the screen don't actually exist at all. They are just a trick of the light. If you turn off the bulb, the universe vanishes. The mystic isn't realizing they are God. The mystic is realizing they are just a shadow on a screen, and only the bulb is real.
It's Semitic monotheism pushed through a Neoplatonic prism. He managed to validate the mystic's feeling of total annihilation and union without violating the orthodox insistence that God is completely separate and unique. He gave him a safe vocabulary.
It is an incredible intellectual tightrope walk.
Yeah.
And he pulled it off. He made Sufism intellectually respectable. But if Ghazali built the bridge back to orthodoxy, the next guy we're looking at, Ibn Arabi, who died in 1240, built an absolute impenetrable fortress of systematization.
Ibn Arabi is the zenith of Sufi philosophy. His output was staggering. The text notes he wrote over 400 genuine works. And he didn't just write them like a normal scholar. In many of them, he claimed he was taking direct dictation from God in flashes of inspiration, or was commanded by the Prophet Muhammad in a vision to write them.
He lived a deeply cosmopolitan life. Born in Islamic Spain, traveled widely through North Africa, Mecca, Baghdad, and finally settled in Damascus. He absorbed every intellectual current of his time. And the core, monumental doctrine he developed across all those hundreds of books is known as the unity of being, or wadat al-Wujud.
To understand Ibn Arabi, you really have to grasp this specific concept. Can you unpack the mechanics of the unity of being?
Ibn Arabi distinguishes between two aspects of reality. First, there is God as the hidden, undivided, eternal, absolute reality, which he calls the real, or al-Haq. Second, there is God as manifested in the infinite multiplicity of created objects, animals, and people, which he calls the creation, or al-Khalq.
But the key is that he says the real and the creation, the one and the many, the eternal and the temporal, are not two different things. They are essentially one and the same reality. God is multiplied only through his attributes reflecting in the mirror of creation.
And this leads to his most incredible and controversial concept, the perfect man, al-Insan al-Kamil. Ibn Arabi argued that divinity and humanity aren't two distinct natures separated by an unbridgeable gulf. They're just two aspects, the inward and the outward of one single reality. Man is the microcosm of the whole creation.
Okay, I want to visualize this perfect man concept. It sounds like a fractal or a hologram. If you take a holographic plate with a 3D image on it and smash it into pieces, every tiny little shard still contains the entire 3D image of the whole.
Exactly.
Ibn Arabi is saying that the perfect man is that tiny shard that flawlessly reflects the absolute whole of the universe and the divine nature itself.
That is an incredibly accurate way to model it. Man embodies all the perfections of the universe. Ibn Arabi views the Prophet Muhammad as the highest, most complete manifestation of this perfect man. The text actually draws a direct analogy here for Western listeners. Ibn Arabi's concept of the reality of Muhammad functions almost exactly like the Christian concept of the Logos, the divine creative principle or word through which the entire world was made and sustained.
It elevates humanity's role in the cosmos dramatically. We aren't just dirt that God breathes into. We are the mirror God uses to see himself. And this raises an important question. Why did God create all this? If God was perfectly hidden and unified as the real, why manifest into a messy multiple universe with this perfect man at the center? Ibn Arabi points to a famous, incredibly beautiful tradition where God says, "I was a hidden treasure and I love to be known."
I was a hidden treasure and I love to be known. The driving force of the entire creation, the reason the universe exists at all, isn't a test. It isn't a courtroom. It is simply love and the desire to be perceived. God wanted to see his own beauty, so he created the universe as a mirror, and the perfect man is the clearest reflection in that mirror.
Ibn Arabi gave Sufism this incredibly heavy, robust, undeniable philosophical framework. But let's be real heavy, philosophy doesn't generally move the masses. Most normal people aren't going to sit down and read a 400-book, dense theological treatise on the unity of being.
No, they are not.
If this movement was going to capture the hearts of the common people, this complex theology of unity needed to be translated into pure emotional art.
It needed a voice that could bypass the intellect and speak directly to the soul. And that brings us to the poetic zenith of Sufism, and arguably one of the greatest, most widely read mystical poets in world history, Jalal al-Din Rumi, who died in 1273.
Rumi's backstory is incredibly dramatic on its own. He wasn't born a poet. His family had to flee their home in Central Asia ahead of the advancing, devastating Mongol hordes led by Genghis Khan. He traveled across the Islamic world and eventually settled in Konya, in modern-day Turkey. He was a highly respected judge, a preacher, a very solid, respectable, orthodox scholar. But then at age 37, his entire world gets turned upside down when he meets an eccentric, itinerant, wandering mystic named Shams al-Din of Tabriz.
That meeting in the marketplace of Konya is the catalyst for everything that follows. The bond between Rumi, the respectable scholar, and Shams, the wild wanderer, was intense, transformative, and completely all-consuming. It was a passionate spiritual love. Rumi felt that every moment he spent talking with Shams, he was literally in touch with the Supreme Soul, the Divine Beloved.
And then Shams disappears.
Yes, Shams eventually disappears, likely murdered by Rumi's jealous disciples, and the immense grief and love Rumi felt poured out of him in a torrent of unparalleled poetry.
He effectively took Ibn Arabi's incredibly dense philosophy of the unity of being and translated it into ecstatic verse. His epic, multi-volume masterpiece is called the Mathnawi. There is an excerpt in our sources that perfectly illustrates how he translates the philosophy of unity into poetry. I want to read this because it's breathtaking.
Please do.
Rumi writes, "If there is any lover in the world, O Muslims, 'tis I. If there be any believer, infidel, or Christian hermit, 'tis I. The wine dregs, the cupbearer, the minstrel, the harp and the music, the beloved, the candle, the drink, and the joy of the drunken, 'tis I."
It is breathtaking because of its sheer audacity. He doesn't stop there either. He goes on in the poem to claim that he is the earth, the air, the water, the fire, the body, and the soul. He claims he is truth and falsehood, good and evil. He even says he is the tormenting fire of hell and the blissful paradise of Eden.
It's the ultimate artistic expression of unity. If God is all that truly exists, as Ghazali and Ibn Arabi argued, and the mystic has completely dissolved into God through fana, then the mystic is simultaneously everything and nothing. In fact, Rumi even uses his massive cultural influence in poetry to defend Bastami, the guy who famously claimed "glory be to me" and had to fake madness to survive.
Yes, Rumi beautifully rehabilitates Bastami's heretical statements for the masses. Rumi argues that when Bastami yelled, "I am God," he wasn't speaking out of human arrogance, he was simply a hollow mirror. The mystic's ego is entirely annihilated, completely deleted. Therefore, the mystic is safe. Nothing is seen in the mirror of the mystic but the reflection of another.
And that idea of being hollowed out leads to what is probably Rumi's most famous and enduring metaphor, the reed flute. He writes about divine love as a sweet madness that heals all infirmities. He says, "Did my beloved only touch me with his lips, I too, like the flute, would burst out in melody."
Think about the physical mechanics of a flute. To be a flute, a piece of reed must be cut away from its home in the riverbed. That's the pain of separation from God. Then it must be violently hollowed out. Its inner pith must be completely removed. You must be emptied of your own substance, your own ego, your own desires, so that the breath of the beloved can pass through you to make music. As Rumi concludes, the beloved is all that lives, the lover a dead thing.
It's so beautiful, but when you really look at it, it brings us right back to that terrifying concept of fana total self-destruction, the factory reset, just wrapped in the most gorgeous, seductive language imaginable. It's the grim asceticism of the 8th century evolved into 13th century high art.
Exactly.
And Rumi's legacy wasn't just his poetry on a page. After he died, his son founded an official order based on his teachings, which incorporated his poetry and dancing, and they became famous as the Whirling Dervishes. And this marks the final major evolution in our story today.
We are moving from the era of solitary ascetics starving in the desert and individual renegade preachers getting executed in the streets into the era of massive institutionalization. Sufism becomes organized into massive, structured global fraternities known as the tariqa.
The source text outlines several major orders that span the globe. You have the Qadiriyya, founded in Baghdad, which spread its influence all the way from Morocco to India and down into the Sudan. You have the Suhrawardiya, you have the Shatiliya, which absolutely dominated North Africa, and of course the Malawiya in Turkey, which are Rumi's whirling dervishes.
What we see in this phase is a massive shift toward popular religion. Mysticism isn't just for the intellectual elite or the hardcore ascetics anymore. In some regions, like under the Almohades in North Africa, Sufism actually received official, robust state support for the first time. It became deeply entrenched in everyday popular life, commerce, and politics.
It also started blending and syncretizing with local pre-Islamic cultures as it expanded. The text explicitly mentions how in North Africa you see the rise of Maraboutism, which is essentially a cult of local saints, where Sufism found fertile soil in the vestiges of ancient local animism and magic among the Berbers.
It became a massive, diverse, global phenomenon. But we also have to look at how these ancient orders exist in the modern world. The text points out a figure like Ben al-Liwa, who died in 1934 in Algeria. He brought a highly radical syncretic monism to European intellectuals in the 20th century, proving that the deep intellectual vitality of the movement was still sparking.
But those sparks are facing a lot of wind today. Now, before we get into this next part, I need to state very clearly for our listeners, our sources point out that today, these ancient orders are being battered from multiple sides. On one hand, you have the rise of secularism and modern nationalism. On the other hand, you have fundamentalist movements like the Wahhabis in Arabia or the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, who view Sufi practices as heretical innovations. We are just reporting what our source material lays out here. We aren't taking sides in these modern theological or political debates, but merely observing the historical reality that Sufism finds itself squeezed by the modern world.
It is a highly precarious position. And the text notes an internal challenge as well. There is a tendency in some of the more popular modern manifestations of these orders to degenerate into a mere mechanical repetition of God's name. simply seeking a hypnotic trance state without the rigorous philosophical underpinning or the intense ethical self-examination that originally defined the movement?
It's a stark contrast, isn't it? You compare the mechanical chanting for tourists in some modern context to the radical, dangerous, boundary-breaking intellectualism of guys like Hallaj and Junayd in the ninth and 10th centuries. It really highlights how much a movement inevitably shifts and softens as it becomes an institution itself.
The rebellion became the establishment. The window became just another wall. But the core yearning, that desperate human desire to bypass the rigid structures and experience direct, unmediated communion with the ultimate reality, is still the beating heart of it all, hidden right beneath the surface.
Which brings us to the end of this incredible historical journey. We started with terrified ascetics in the desert, weeping over the final judgment. We watched a woman named Rabia completely upend the system by introducing radical, disinterested love, rendering the holiest physical shrines obsolete.
We saw brilliant minds in Baghdad map the soul.
And others take it so far they had to fake madness to avoid the executioner. We watched Hallaj pay the ultimate horrific price for refusing to stay quiet, leading giants like Ghazali and Ibn Arabi to build philosophical Neoplatonic fortresses to save the movement.
And finally, we saw all that tension burst into the sweet madness of Rumi's poetry before settling into the massive global fraternities we see today.
It is a sweeping, multi-century historical arc, but at its center, it's not really about history or empires. It's a deeply intimate, timeless story about the human condition and the architecture of the soul.
So what does this all mean for you?
Right. It means that this history is a masterclass in how human beings grapple with the tension between following the rules and seeking genuine transformative meaning. Whether you're looking at a religious institution, a corporate structure, a political system, or just the habits of your own daily life, that tension is always there.
The structure keeps us safe. It keeps society functioning.
But the spirit, the willingness to break the rules for something higher, keeps us alive.
We need the walls to survive, but we also desperately need the window to breathe.
And I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over, a paradox that builds on everything we've talked about today but flips it on its head. The entire ultimate goal of this mystical movement, from Junayd to Rumi, was fana, the absolute destruction, erasure, and hollowing out of the individual ego so you could merge seamlessly into the infinite and become nothing.
Right.
And yet, isn't it profoundly ironic that a movement strictly dedicated to erasing the self ended up producing some of the most unique, unforgettable, and celebrated individual personalities in human history? Figures like Rabia, Hallaj, and Rumi stand out as some of the boldest, most distinct individuals ever recorded. How is it that the quest to become absolutely nothing, to hollow yourself out entirely, is exactly what ultimately makes you immortal? Keep seeking that window, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.